All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the first class of our Zohar mini-series, Illuminating the Book of Radiance. Light, 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 light. It's very exciting because there is literally no text like the Zohar. It is a radically unique book. It is a radically unique experience to learn it, and it's a radically unique way to approach Torah and way to approach Torah learning. And I'm really excited to be serve as a kind of guide to help facilitate your becoming familiar or exposed to this text. So in today's class, we're going to be introducing ourselves to the Zohar as, I would say, a phenomenon. We're going to look at the different ways that the Zohar speaks, the different genres that the Zohar includes, and also the different ways that the Zohar functions. So we'll be looking at three major, let's say, dynamics that the Zohar exhibits or inhabits. One is what I would call radical poetry. The second one is Zohar as radical Midrash. And the third as prosody, right, as a narrative involving a setting, and thus actually introducing the element of the social, right, the communal aspect, and the way that the Zohar is a text that intends itself to be studied in community. It's something that travels between people, and that's essential to it. We'll see that the language of flowing, light and water are interchangeable in Zoharic language because they both flow, right? In terms of quantum physics, right? Light flows too. Water and light are flowing. It's the circuits of intensity. It's what's circulating between us, and that's true both when it comes to, again, the diagram of the Sefirot, right, the ways in which the different aspects of God, the different dynamics that are flowing between the different aspects of God's personality, but also the ways in which we, as participants in the project of Zohar, in the practice of Zohar, the way that we actually are also interchanging and flowing between us as well. So it's happening vertically, it's happening horizontally, it's happening radially, right? It's happening even within ourselves. So we'll see all of that. Hopefully we'll get through all of it. And we'll see, again, the Zohar as this complex object, this complex subject to involve ourselves in. So let's look at the source sheet together. So what is Zohar? So first of all, just the word Zohar. Is anyone just familiar with what the word means?
Isn't it radiance?
Yeah, radiance, light, brilliance, illumination, or whatever word you want to use that's like, again, light, 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 light. Zohar is some kind of radiance, some kind of brilliance, some kind of illumination. So first I want to start, though, with a short text from the Talmud. And in the Talmud, there's a beautiful passage from the Masechta of Horayos. And Horayos is an odd tractate. It's in the order of torts, Nezikin, and it basically is just an ordering of different teachings from the rabbis. It's kind of like an anthology. It's not really organized thematically per se, but like how the Nezikin involves judge stuff in it, like juridical stuff in it. So stuff about testifying and teaching and things like that. That's kind of, it's set down as precedent or case law. So in Horayos, we have a number of examples of what one of the teachers of the Talmud is telling his students. And he's saying a number of like kind of points of advice as he's saying how to go about learning Torah. And one of the things he says is V'chi garsitu garsu al nahara de maya. Dechi heichi de mishkan maya mishkan shmataichu. Again, the reason I wanted to say it again in the Aramaic is because even though this is the Talmud, I would call this a quasi or proto-Zoharic passage. Because what's happening is it's a rhythmic kind of language. It's a rhythmic kind of language that involves, yeah, exactly, the river as a site of change, as Eric, I think, just implied. It's dynamic, right? It's flowing. You can't step in the same river twice, as Eric just said in the chat. But also we see just in the poetics of the language, right? V'chi garsitu garsu. Nahara de Maya, de Mishkan Maya Mishkan, right? We see the way in this, we see the sounds repeat themselves. It's consonant, it's assonant, right? We have the sense of a flow to the language itself as it's speaking about sitting by a flowing body of water. Also, again, the conjunction of light and water shows up here too, because Nahara means ha-nahar, right? The river, the stream. But Nahara in Aramaic in the Zohar also means light. So we see the word show up in it looks the exact same. It means both river and it means light. So later in the text, I actually translate it as light river, right? Or river of light. But here I want to say that the reason that the rabbi is encouraging learning by, well, maybe I'll put it to you. Why do you think that the rabbi here is encouraging his disciple to study by a river? When you study, study by a river, so as the waters flow, your teachings flow as well.
I mean, it sounds like the river, in some sense, acts as a kind of teacher in itself. The representation, the way it looks, what it does, how it moves, is a reminder of how you should study, how you should think, the kind of a metaphor maybe for how to learn.
Beautiful. So there's a pedagogy to the river, right? It models some kind of dynamic that you're supposed to learn from. And just as the river flows, you flow as well, right? It teaches you how to embody the flow of Torah. Great. Other ideas?
To help it free your mind.
Free your mind. Yeah. So just like the river is free, the river flows. Or like the song from Pippin, right? So like you're freeing, you're free like the river, right? Like the river flows, you want to let your mind flow as well. You want to unstop it. You want to let it go full force, like a gushing river, like a waterfall. You want the thoughts just to be free. Beautiful. Yeah, great. So so we had an example of pedagogy, right? That the river is modeling the dynamic of a flowing Torah. And Ellen just said that the river also actually has some kind of psychological impact, that being near a river in some ways helps our minds loosen up so that our thoughts start flowing. Okay, any other ideas? Yeah, Kathy?
It's also a symbol of movement.
Mm-hmm. Say more.
One place to another. So if you're learning something, you're going from unknown, not knowing it, to knowing more of it anyway, and then being able to use that to progress to perhaps another idea or thought.
Beautiful. So the river is dynamic. It moves. It's a river courses a journey, right? It runs its course from A to B, and it's moving towards something as it flows towards something else, embodying the way that you grow. There's another beautiful text about Torah, in Maya Torah, right? There's no water but Torah. Another one about actually how like a drip of water is able to bore through a hard rock. And that showed Rabbi Akiva, even when he was 40 years old, that he could still start learning now, because it's not too late, because it's just, it's called the hard boring, was it the slow boring of hard boards, right? To get through something dense like that actually requires something like water, like a water drill, something that takes, it's progressing, it's moving by steps and steps and steps. Great. I want to say also that I think that this teaching from the Talmud implies an attention towards setting, right? Now, I don't mean to be too hippy-dippy here, but setting is a technical term from psychedelic therapy. And in psychedelic therapy, the guide in a psychedelic experience helps create a setting for you. Right here, I think this is a notion, like i.e. the way in which the environment in which you are having this kind of psychedelic experience, not just physical, but also psychological, emotional, right? Creating a setting, like kind of like a play. Right, so similarly, lahavdil. But Torah has a setting as well. That being in the right dynamic, being in the right environment is going to influence the way that you learn. It's going to influence the Torah that comes out of your mouth. So I think everyone has said something that was brilliant and really contributed. And I want to go through it just to summarize before we move on. So the river is related to Torah in a number of ways. One, as Kathy said, it symbolizes growth because it's a process. Right? It symbolizes the way that learning is something that moves, and something that moves from one place to another. Ellen said that it also symbolizes, or maybe even influences, the stream of consciousness, right? The flowing of our thought, to unstop our thinking, to let our thinking flow freely. So creativity, our minds moving, and the like. Eric said that the river actually symbolizes change, right? It's dynamic, and Torah is not something that's fixed. It's not something that's static, but rather something dynamic and alive, right? It's the Torah of the living God. It's eternal. And last but not least, Leon was saying that it is a pedagogy of sorts. It's modeling, right? And I would say, maybe going back to my point about setting, I think these work together, that it's giving us an example of the way in which Torah is supposed to flow. And by being near the river, it teaches you, right? The river teaches you how to flow with the Torah. So I think all of these dynamics and everything that you intuited, everything that you found, I think is really precisely in the Zohar. So I'm really glad that we were able to dig in and find those implicit teachings in this Talmudic text. I mean, it's worth noting, right, that the Zohar is not something separate from the Talmud. People talk about like Kabbalah versus the Talmud, rationalism versus mysticism. It's all one big Torah, right? The Zohar is intensifying, building on Midrash, building on Kabbalah, Gemara, building on Tanakh, right? It's building on all these things. The Gemara is a deeply important text for the Zohar as well. Okay, so we're going to see, I think, how all of the flows end up reappearing and representing themselves in our learning of the Zohar. So first, I want to give an example of what I would call not just Zohar as poetry, but if I can be a little indulgent, I would say Zohar as meta-poetry, because this is, or Zohar as ars poetica, right? This is Zohar talking about itself. And there's a reason I teach this text. I love teaching this text to introduce people to the Zohar, because it's the Zohar riffing kind of like a jazz, like bebop song on itself, on the theme of Zohar. So every time I say the word Zohar, I'm going to go like, Zohar, right? It's like, I want to, Zohar, right? Like Radiance, yeah. Right? But I say that playfully, but I actually am deadly serious in the sense that there is something quite jazzy about the dynamic poetics of the Zohar. It's improvisatory, it's free-flowing, and it is deeply responsive, like the way in which like a jazz combo works and plays off of each other. I think you'll feel that momentum, feel that energy within the text, the dynamos of it. So I want you just to focus on the way in which the Zohar is going to try to bring your attention to this verse. So we start by saying, these are the names of the Israelites who came to Egypt with Jacob, each person with their clan they came. ... Right? This is the first verse of the book of Shmos. This is the first Zohar in Zohar on Shmot. Right? The Zohar, as it's published at least, is organized like a commentary on the Torah. So this is the first Zohar that appears on the book of Shmot, the book of Exodus. And like any good Midrash, and we'll see later how Zohar is like Midrash, it starts with what's called a kiruv, and then it goes to a rachok. It starts with a verse nearby, right? The first verse of Exodus, and then it zooms somewhere else in the Tanakh, usually off in Ketuvim somewhere, off in the miscellaneous section near the end of the Tanakh. So it quotes Daniel, and the question that the Midrashist or the Zoharist here has is, how do I bring these two disparate verses together? Right? How do I see how the Shmos verse can only be understood when it's read in dialogue with the Daniel verse, with the verse from Daniel? Right? That's the way that Midrash works. This is a beautiful text. Maybe I'll bring in later, but Midrash is depicted, Ben Azai is depicted as linking all of the verses of the Torah together, and that's what Midrash does. It tries to show you that the Torah is not just like a book in order. The Torah is an organic whole. You don't read it in order. You read it by constantly paging back and forth, because you can only understand it with itself. Like, that's how you understand Torah, by learning itself on itself. It's a commentating on itself. Okay. So this is a very famous verse, and we'll see why it's especially important for a book called the Zohar. V'hamaskilim yazhiru kizohar harakia. You hear that? Umatzdike arabim kakochavim la'olam va'ed. All right, the enlightened will radiate like the radiance, the Zohar of the skies, and the ones who bring merits to others, the matzdike harabim, will shine like stars forever. Right? So one thing I want to encourage us to do as we learn Zohar especially is free your mind. Is to engage your imagination. The Zohar is a deeply imaginative text, and by that what I mean is it is asking you to work with imagery in your brain. So it's a deeply imagistic text, right? It's using symbolism and images and the like. And the point is to create impressions in your mind that you are responding to. So again, it's flowing. It's flowing between the text and your mind, okay? So maskil misir kazor rakio matzdika rabim kochesh la'olam, right? They're shining like stars forever and ever. So now it's going to try to teach out what each part of this verse means. The maskilim, who are these enlightened, these are those who gaze into the secret of wisdom, of chokhmah. Okay? Or alternatively, and this is important to note, you will not find, like, you will find so many alternative readings, like alternative versions of the text, not just translations, like literally the text, the editor of the text in the 16th century, the 18th century is like, well, I have two different versions in front of me, so I'm going to include both, and you can decide which one you think is right. So one version is those who gaze into the secret of wisdom, and the other version is who radiate sparks in the secret of wisdom. And the difference between that is like not obvious. And I would say just like, again, just kind of let it wash over you. We're not going to kind of dwell too much on every little part, or we'll never even get past like 3 lines. There's something to be said, by the way, about learning Zohar and like actually doing a serious chunk of it, because it moves, right? It's really moving. You want to get a sense of the whole. So the enlightened, like these are people who have some kind of special way of looking, special way of using their like mind's eye, right, to peer into or to have some kind of dynamic relationship with the secret of wisdom, right? And we know from previous classes, secret of wisdom, that's probably referring in some way to the inner recesses of God's being, right? The sfirot in some way or another. It could specifically refer to chokhmah. It could just refer to the like wisdom of the sfirot in general, something like that. Okay, and they'll radiate. They shine and sparkle in the effulgence means light, in the effulgence of supernal wisdom. Okay, so again, dynamic, right? It is dialogical. So they gaze into, or they radiate into the secret of wisdom. When we say secret, we mean something secret within God. And what happens to them? Yeah, exactly. They're like Susie enacted, right? Like it's kind of like the nice version of Nietzsche, right? You gaze into the abyss, and the abyss gazes back into you. This one, you gaze into the secret of wisdom, and you are illumined by it, right? You are lit up by it. So just as they gaze into or shine their light into God, God shines God's light back into us. So it's a flow. You see how it's reciprocal. It goes back and forth. Just as you engage in something, it engages with you as well. Okay, like the radiance, and here we get to the way when Zohar is going to start riffing. So like the Zohar, the scintilla and sparks of the light river that flows from Eden. This is the hidden secret that is called the skies. In it are fixed the stars and constellations, sun and moon, all the lamps of light. Okay. What? Help. What just happened? Where did we just go? Think about context. When we started explaining the verse from Daniel, it was very theoretical, right? It wasn't localized. It wasn't like concrete. It was like, okay, the enlightened. These are the special enlightened people who have access in some way to the secret of God's being, and they radiate into it, and God radiates into them. It's very generic, right? It's general. It's not saying who these people are. It's not situating them any way, shape, or form. But now when we're talking about the radiance, the Zohar Harakiya, the radiance of the sky, now where are we? Or when are we? What setting are we availing ourselves of?
This is talking about Bereshit from Eden.
Exactly.
So it's going back to creation.
Good. So Daniel, right, is a later not even a prophet, an apocalyptic work in the Tanakh, right? That's taking place around the 6th century BCE in the Persian Empire, right? It's preceding the Book of Esther. Okay. Now, it's not technically prophecy because he's not in the land of Israel, and he's not revealed like a prophecy, like in words of God. He's revealed crazy images, right? That's why it's called an apocalypse. Apocalypse means a revelation. Okay. So Daniel is looking towards the end times, right? The enlightened will shine in the radiance of the sky. He's some kind of like what's going to happen when Mashiach comes, right? What's going to happen at the end of history. But as we know, right, with like time goes in Judaism, time is linear, it goes forward, but it's also cyclical, right? We repeat the Torah again. The calendar repeats itself. The ritual calendar of Judaism is cyclical. So when we go to the end times, we also zoom back to the beginning as well. So Daniel's talking about the rakia at the end of time, but rakia is also a word that's used when, Lauren, I'm bringing you back. When's rakia used?
It's used like the river coming from Eden. So that's from creation. It takes us all the way back to Bereshit.
The second day of creation, right? The thing that God creates is rakia, right? It's the firmament, it's the heavens, however you want to translate it. So, just as they're radiating, they're illuminating, right? The sky, like the stars in the sky in the afterlife or at the end of time, but also we're drawing on the original heavens, the original sky at the beginning of time, right? When the world is created. Okay? So this is and we're brought back to the moment, like we're brought back to the secret inner recesses of God's creative dynamic, God's creative moment, God's creative power. So if you had a chance to look at the introduction, like in a history video, right, there's a number of different important settings, right, that Kabbalah draws on. And one of them is Ma'aseh Bereshit, right? One of them is prehistory, pre-time, just as like in that liminal space, just as the world is coming into being. That's something that Kabbalah is saying, we're going to give you access to something that's happening before history, right? Before you're even able to have any empirical understanding of anything at all. We're going to use our special way of relating to Torah to help us gain wisdom of the secret, like the secrets of wisdom, right? Gain insight into this whole realm that's not accessible to us, right? As we said, you're not supposed to look before and after. You're not supposed to look above and beneath. And Kabbalah is like, well, I'm going to try to create a safe, guided setting in which we can start exploring these things in the right environments, right? In a trusted teacher-student relationship, which is the only safe way you're supposed to do that according to the Talmud. The Talmud says you're only supposed to reveal these secret matters just between like a close circle or just between you and one student. Right, so the idea here is that you're only supposed to keep these things in close quarters. You're not just supposed to kind of broadcast them widely. These things require careful attention and a close relationship. So bringing in, again, the social dynamic here. So the sparks of this river of light that flows from Eden. And this is the hidden secret that's called Harakia, right? In it are fixed the stars and constellations, sun and moon, all the lamps of light. Be kayamin kochvaya umazale shimsha v'sihara v'chol inun butzinin dinahora. Right, we hear the rhythm of the language. Right, so it's this. I mean, again, just engage your imagination. Just this radiant, sparkling skyscape. Right, that's what's the experience of taking in this language is a huge part of it. It is about understanding it. You need to get what it's saying, but it's also about experiencing it. It's a beautiful, and that's what's different about poetry, right? Poetry is different than prose in the sense that poetry is not strictly describing something. It's not like telling a story. Poetry is trying to make something happen in your brain. It's trying to make something happen inside of you by evoking something from you or invoking something with you. Right? So Zohar is trying to induce something within us. It's trying to have us experience something. Okay. Here comes the jazz. Zohar. These skies shine light on the garden, baby, and the tree of life stands in the middle, whose branches shelter all the forms, trees, and fragrant bushes in the garden with fitting garments. and beneath it all its beasts find shade, and all the birds of the sky dwell in its branches. Now that image of this huge tree that's spread over all of creation, every creature is under it, birds and beasts, everything created by God. That's drawing from a different verse from Daniel, Daniel 4, 7-9. It's talking about like a cosmic tree that again spreads over the whole world and has beautiful foliage sheltering every single animal. All the beasts of the field and all the birds of the sky are nestled under its branches, right? So this is the cosmic tree. But the cosmic tree here now is which tree? Right? Remember, we're in the setting of the Garden of Eden, the setting of Breshit. So what's the tree here?
This is the tree of life.
It's the tree of life, right? It says it explicitly. But
Yeah,
now
not
what?
the tree of knowledge, but the tree of life.
Right, exactly. So it's the tree of life. Now, tree of life is most important in the narrative in the sense that we never get it. Right? We don't get the tree of life. We eat the tree of knowledge.
Yeah, but the image of a huge tree under which everyone is protected is also the image of an Asherah. We were just studying that in Avodah Zarah, that's the primal image of an Asherah. So
I don't think an Asherah is a large canopy tree. An Asherah is a sacral tree that's assigned.
Well, okay, I'm just saying that they're but it brings that to mind so that you're that division, that it is not an Asherah, that it is part of part of Hashem is I thought important at this point.
Yeah, for sure. So we have our own imminent, we have our own Torah-itic language of tree, right? There's the tree of knowledge and there's the tree of life. And the tree of life here, I want to actually kind of encourage us to reread it a little bit. Where it's like, oh, tree of life, right? Because maybe the idea is that eating its fruit would mean we'd be immortal, right? It's the tree of life. Instead, I think it's saying it's the tree of life. This is the tree of all of life, right? It's the tree that shelters all living things. It's the tree that includes all of life in it. So this is, I want to say it. I want to say something, but I want to actually encourage us not to bust our brains about it. This text is a great example of, again, poetry, right? In the sense that it uses evocative images and association and lots of beautifully rich ways of describing things that again evoke images in our mind. It's also an example of what we can call esoteric writing, right? The Zohar is esoteric in the sense that it deals with secrets. That's what it means to be esoteric. It's a discourse of secrets. But it's esoteric in the sense that it's encoding something. Now, the Zohar is actually more slantwise than you'd expect it to be. Because this is actually an encoded narrative about the Sefirot, or about the process of emanation. But except for that one reference to Chokhmah up there, you're not going to see any naming of the Sefirot from here on through the end of it. But this is an encoded way of talking about God's emergence, of God's self as the world is created as well, right? There's this parallel creating of the Sefirot, or creation, emanating of the Sefirot as the world is emerging into being, right? We talked about that in the introductory classes. Right? God emerges as the world emerges, as we emerge, right? It's all happening in a parallel kind of way. But it's worth noting, right, is that the Zohar is asking you to pay attention and to start decoding it. Because it almost never uses the language of Sefirot. It doesn't use that word. It uses other words like midot or names or days or things like that. And it doesn't usually name the Sefirot. It usually uses code names for them or associative names or things like that, and expects you to pick up on certain triggers, right? If you see the number 6 below, it probably refers to Tiferet because Tiferet is the 6th central Sefirot. Or the 5 here also refers to one of the, refers probably to Gevura as well. But the point is that, like, I actually want us to not just turn this into a code book. I want us rather to pay attention to the experience of the images and of the dynamic of the poetry. Because the point is that it's being concealed in these fitting garments, right? We talked about that before. Revelation is both disclosure, me saying something, articulating something, but doing it in a way that conceals it in language, right? Because that's demanding some kind of involvement from you to help involve you in what it means to make it mean something at all. So I want to leave it in this kind of associative, evocative place. We don't need to worry about decoding it into this Firo. This isn't a theology class. We did that before. This is a Zohar class. And the point of it is really gaining a familiarity with the way the Zohar moves and the Zohar works. That's what today's about. Okay, we're not trying to reduce the Zohar to what it means. We're trying to understand it as it means. We're trying to get familiarity with how it articulates itself. So I want to, like, encourage some ambiguity, even some ambivalence here. Okay, so Zohar, right? So we have this cosmic tree, which you'll see in a lot of different, like, religious systems. That's definitely true. But this cosmic tree at the center of the world, at the center of creation, it's stretching over all of existence, and everything finds shelter within it, right? So this is the source of all life as it's about to then, it's contained in this one thing, and then, like the Big Bang, it's going to start releasing itself. Zohar, the fruit of the trees give life to all, sustained forever and ever. But the other side has no purchase there, only the side of holiness. How worthy is the portion of those who taste it, sustained forever and ever. These are called the enlightened, the maskilim, who merit life in this world and life in the world that is coming. Okay, so how do we just move from this image again of the cosmic world-encompassing tree, and now what are we talking about? Not just what the tree is, but now what it does, right? What it does for others. The fruit that it gives out, right? In the way that it sustains life. So here we do have the idea that the tree of life actually does bring you into, in some way, right, the life of the world that is coming. The way that the Zohar in Aramaic, right, says Ha'olam hazeh, Olam hazeh and Olam haba, is Alma Hadaya, right, this world, and then Alma Da'ate, which might just mean the world to come, but literally translated means the world that is coming. And it's this much more dynamic, kind of process-oriented way of understanding the world to come, right? It's not just something that exists on the other side of something, but it's a dynamic that's steadily approaching, or that we're approaching it, that we have some kind of progressive we progress in our relationship to it. We bring it in, and it brings us into it as well. It's the world that is coming. It's dynamic. It's active. Okay, so this tree of life. Zohar, right? Zohar. Zohar. This tree stretches up, 500 parasangs in length, 600,000 in its expanse. Now, 600,000, I said it's 6, is probably Tiferes, but besides that, 600,000, important number, important Jewish number. What's 600,000?
The Exodus.
Good. What about the Exodus?
Traditionally, 600,000 people left Egypt.
Excellent. Good. So 600,000 is used as the kind of like quick reference to refer to a complete set of a lot. Like, it's a big number of a lot, but it's complete. 600,000 souls in Israel from, like, the beginning of creation down, but we get that number from Exodus. Eric was exactly right. And also, traditionally speaking, how many letters are there in the Torah? 600,000. Now, is that empirically correct? I don't want to know. It doesn't matter. But the point is that we have tradition, we have Masorah, that there's 600,000 letters in the Torah and 600,000 souls in Israel. It's a beautiful teaching from the Eish Kodesh, the Piazetzner Rebbe, that says, just as if you had one letter that was out of place or one letter scratched away, the whole Torah is puzzle. So is it that if one soul of Israel is not present and their Torah isn't present, then our whole Torah is puzzle as well. It's not fit. It's not valid anymore. That to have a complete people of Israel and a complete Torah, we need everyone's Torah. We need everyone's perspective, everyone's soul, everyone's authentic self. It's a beautiful teaching. So 600,000 again is it's this complete panoply. It's the fullness of it. So the tree contains all the souls in it. It's the tree of souls. It's the tree of life, right? Tree of the whole world, the cosmic tree. It's the tree of all souls. In this tree exists one light, Zohara, right? Again, same language, in which exists all colors. These colors which ascend and descend settle only in that tree. When they emerge from it to appear in a radiance, right? To appear brilliantly as light, to shine, but that does not shine. They settle and do not settle. They subsist and do not subsist, since they cannot fully settle in another place. Again, evocative language. You're not like, don't worry about getting it. So let's try to figure it out. Like, what's it trying to evoke in us? First of all, let's pay attention to its poetic techniques. Okay, so again, repeating language, repeating words that keep on popping up again. Zohar, Zohar, Zohar. We're saying this is the Zohar talking about itself in a way. So Zohar is this tree, right? The light is the tree that encompasses all. But like we talked about in the first sessions, right? It uses the metaphor of the light. It's a light that contains all colors, right? Just like white light contains all colors in it, and when it hits a prism, it diffracts or refracts, and all the light, and all the colors of the rainbow come out of it, right? So we have this controlling image of this of sphirot, of emanation, of entrance into existence. That we have something that contains all, and as it progresses, it ends up differentiating and individuating and becoming a world of this against that, right? I'm different from you. But at some point originally, we were all in the source together, right? Red is different than blue, but they both have their origin in white light. Okay, so this story it's telling, and the reason it's using this metaphor of light is because the story of light, the imagery of light, is one of an origin in unity, and then some kind of moment of psh, right, of differentiation, and then existing and individuating in difference. Okay, now think of a tree. Worth noting, trees in Kabbalah are always upside down. The tree starts unified in the trunk and then stretches itself, right, with the branches becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, and many and many, many branches. And it encompasses everything inside of it. Right? So the tree becomes a storehouse, an origin of all, but then it also becomes the venue, the space for everything's becoming as it extends into existence, right? And as the world is birthed. So we have both this kind of this physical image, right? Physics, optical image of light, but also this organismic, organic image of a tree, right? The tree is this living thing. The light is alive. It's not just radiation. We're talking about something that's dynamic and alive, right? The light is alive like a tree is. Okay, now another poetic technique I want to pay attention to, and this is something that poetry does that philosophy can't do and that narrative can't do, is that it is using paradox. Can you show me where the paradox is? Or the conjunction of opposites, the conjunctius oppositorum, as Nicola de Cusa would say. You can also maybe call it apophaticism. It's unspeaking itself. It's saying both itself and its opposite. Can you show me that?
Where it says does not shine, they settle and do not settle, subsist and do not subsist.
Good. So it's a radiance that does not shine. They settle and don't settle. They subsist and do not subsist. Right? Because they can't fully settle. So whereas before, right, in its original source, it's fully settling, because when you're in your source, right, you're in the womb. You're just nestled within it. But we're all yearning to get back to that home, or yearning to get back to that origin. You're yearning to get back to that completely, sustaining environment, right? In which we don't need to do anything to earn our place. We are taken care of fully and holistically. But in the world, right, you have to pay rent. You have to pay mortgage. You have to pay your condo fee, pay maintenance fees. You have to do your dishes, right? For you to have a home, you need to earn it. Now you need to work for it. So you settle and don't settle. I'm using like kind of real world correlations here, right? Real world kind of analogies. You don't have a kind of settling in which like you just have this inherent sense of belonging anymore. You settle, you don't settle, you move, right? Like maybe you live in Toronto, but when I lived in New York City, I'm like, I live in New York City, but I'm not from New York City, right? Like I'm not from here, I'm in this world and I'm not of this world, So, but here we're talking about, right, there's a break in some ways. There's the radiance that shines and there's the radiance that doesn't shine. And that's a fundamental break in the Sphirot. It's a fundamental break in the emanation that's important to kind of recognize. So the radiance that shines, that's like Tiferet and above, right? That's kind of in the more upper reaches of the Sphirot. And the radiance that doesn't shine is referring to Malchut, right? Referring to the kind of the eventuation of the Sphirot. Also the Shekhinah. And we'll talk about that much more later. But it doesn't shine in the sense that Malchut is associated with the moon, whereas Tiferet's associated with the sun. Malchut's also associated with us because we're like the moon too, right? Like we don't have our own internal generator, right? We have capacitors. We're like a solar panel, right? We take in the light and it charges us up, and then we use the energy and we're depleted. Right, so it's a radiance that doesn't shine. It's a radiance that contains and has capacity for light, but it's not producing the light. Right, so that's the light in this world. The light in this world, we don't make it, or we receive it. Okay, but by talking about this again, this kind of this flowing, dynamic image of light, the Zohar, in the reason it's kind of using its name as this motif, right, as this watchword it keeps on coming back to, is because it's trying to help us understand something really important about dynamics, about the way that language moves, imagery moves, light moves, water flows, right? All these things are moving, and the reason poetry is the way that the Zohar talks, and the Zohar really is radical poetics, is because that's the only way for it to both create something, but also at the same time uncreate it, to settle and not settle inside of you, right? This is not a didactic book. It's not telling you something you need to memorize. It's trying to evoke an experience inside of you, and an experience is something that moves, right? You move with it. You experience with it. It's not telling you something. You don't memorize the halachas of Isser v'Heter, right? This isn't about knowing. This is about thinking, and it's about imagining. It's about experience. Right? There's a beautiful book if you want to pursue kind of this, and I'm very influenced by a teacher of mine, Malila Hellner Ashed, who's a brilliant Kabbalah scholar in Jerusalem, and she has a book called what is it called? Like The Light Flows from Eden. The river flows from Eden. Vanar Yotzei Me'eden. I have it in Hebrew. It's a beautiful cover. I just want to find it, show it to you. But it's translated. It's translated in English too. But it's a beautiful cover. But I really highly recommend this book. But she talks about that there's this kind of the language in the Zohar is experiential. It is designed to be dynamic, to evoke or induce in you an experience as you read it. It's supposed to engage your imagination as you do it. So that's why, again, that's the way I've been trying to represent this material. And then finally, we get to from Rachok to Karov, right? We move from the Daniel verse and it eventually gets us to Shmot. And from this tree emerge, again, differentiation, right? 12 tribes which appear within, descend in that radiance, Zohar, that does not shine. Into the exile in Egypt, right? This life that we're in is exile, as it were, right? along with a number of supernal coteries, as it is written, these are the names of the Israelites, Elish, Shemot, Bnei Israel. And this is an important phrase. Rabbi Shimon Patach. And that's how we know it's Midrash. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai opened. And what does it mean when you see the word open in a Midrash? It means that he's going to quote a verse. And then he's going to riff on it. So the reason, I mean, what's fascinating is that this whole beginning section, and we actually saw this in the Gemara, if you remember, this is kind of like a Stama-itic sugya, but in the Gemara, but in the Zohar. This is an anonymous section of the Zohar. It doesn't have a name attached to it. But here comes the main character of the Zohar. Right? This is the main character of the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, an important rabbi that shows up in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. And he's especially renowned for being pretty hardcore. And he's a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, who was pretty hardcore himself, and somebody who gained access to Pardes, someone who, like I talked about in the video, who gained access and was able to enter paradise whole and return whole as well. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the main character of the Zohar. He's the main figure that you see kind of being the object of people's attention, the most dynamic and the most enlightened, the most lauded character or figure in the Zohar. And that'll bring us to the next major section. So Zohar is Midrash. My point was that it is drawing on earlier material and expanding on it. So the image of the cosmic tree, it's taking from Daniel and it's riffing on it. Right? It's expanding it. It's working it out. And then also we saw this about the tree that is 500 parasangs tall. It's taking that from a Midrash from Breshit Rabbah and it's riffing on it. Right? So the Zohar is just, like it's like Torah's Spinal Tap, right? It's turning everything up to 11. It takes the previous material and it makes it the most itself it can be. It just goes the most intense, most vibrant, and most dynamic version of that tradition it can give you to really go into it. And we'll talk all about Zoharic language next week when we talk about what it means to receive language, receive ancient language, and then make it renewed. And that's what the Zohar does. It takes these old things and then remakes them as new again. And that's kind of what's telling us what we do with the Torah. But here I want to move, now we saw the introduction of a character, move into this aspect of the Zohar. So we're moving from Zohar as poetry to Zohar as prosody, right? Zohar as imagery to Zohar as narrative. Now the narratives are going to involve imagery, don't get me wrong. But, so we kind of talked about the content of the Zohar in a sense. Now we're going to talk about its setting. So just to kind of tell you outside, the Zohar is often called, Gershom Scholem famously called it like a mystical novel. And it is a very, I wouldn't call it coherently, but it's a very narratively framed work. That is to say, it has characters, and the characters do things. That's uncommon in Jewish literature. The Talmud has characters, but they're mostly just saying things, right? They're not doing anything. The Zohar brings narrative, it brings dynamic, it brings stories. Now, the Talmud, to be fair, has stories in it, but it's kind of like short stories. Whereas the Zohar has more expanded and worked out narratives, and there's progressed dynamics between the characters. And one thing I really want to stress, which we'll see here, is that the friendship matters the most. We have a small group of characters. There's a zillion rabbis in the Talmud. But in the Zohar, there's kind of main rabbis that keep on showing up again and again and again and again. And while Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, is the most important one, he's the main character, he's the Moses of his age, as we're going to see just now, really what's the most important thing is what's happening between them. And I said before, we have 10 people at one moment, that's very good, significant, because at certain major instances the Zohar, two very important narratival sections called the Idra Zuta and the Idra Rabbah, the great and the small convocation. What's it called when you have like not commencement, what's it called when you have like a professional meeting of people, conference, like a conference, but it's happening on this threshing floor. And at that, and in those instances, there's 10 rabbis there, and they're called chavraya or chavrin, and that means friends. Friendship is a deeply mystical and spiritual thing. to the Zohar, because it's not just that there are 10 random people there. It's 10 people with a deep and powerful relationship to each other. And only through that relationship is Torah able to flow. What's happening between them is the most essential thing. And they end up, in a way, embodying the arrangement of the Sefirot. They end up kind of bringing the Sefirot into themselves, or kind of play acting or role playing as the Sefirot in a way. So the 10 number matters because they end up, in a way, merging with God in that way, but only are able to do so if all of them are there and all of them are together. Yeah, someone want to say something?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I'm just
No.
wondering, like I've heard this idea about like the friendship between the rabbis in the Zohar being really important.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if it's like if it's ever discussed directly in the text, or like if it's something that's been like part of the thinking sort of around the Zohar and Kabbalah and interpretation. Like it feels like something that's come out of Lurianic Kabbalah and the importance of studying groups, but are there actually sources in the book that emphasize sort of the friendship? And if so, where? I'm just curious.
So, Lawrence Fine has been doing some work on that recently. It's very cool stuff. Yeah, so it ends up getting really concretized, and like that's the thing. Like the Zohar again is not a book of it's not a handbook. It's like you're peeping in on people doing incredible things, right? They're not teaching you. They're not giving you the theory of what they're doing. You're witnessing them do it. It's like watching a play, not watching a dramaturg, not like watching a theory of dramaturgy.
I see. So are you saying then that this kind of idea, like the importance of friendship, is sort of something that's been interpreted from just the way that the book is structured, where they're always kind of talking to each other and always in each ot's company?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we will see examples of that in future classes, and I was like, I want to put it in. I want to talk about the social aspect more. We're going to hint at it here, but there's times where you see like them meet each other on the road and just start crying. They're so happy to see each other. They don't need to tell you like, hey, friendship's important. Like they're proving it to you by caring about each other, right? And that Torah is only able to happen in these thick, personal, loving relationships. That's like but they're again, like poetry, they are showing you, not telling you. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, great. Like like yeah, it's demonstrative. Susie, that's a good word. Like like I think Leon, you understand this especially. Like good art, right? It's not just like hammering it into your head. Although I think like, a lot of people nowadays want art just to like tell you the right thing to think. But like that's not what good art does. Good art shows you what life is like. It shows you the real, and that's what Zohar is doing. I mean, Zohar is like lahavdu, right? Zohar is the highest of the high.
Right.
So,
that's though, like when I guess when I came to it, like before I read the Zohar, I'd heard a lot of things about the way that it's kind of structured, and like echoing one of the things you said kind of during the introduction, I'd heard a number of times that it had all these kind of elements of plot, right? Where it had a narrative element that was much more elaborate than you see in the Talmud. But I mean, so far I've only read, like I think the first book, like the first Daniel Matt book, pretty much all the way, right? And I guess I'm starting to wonder if, like, I've noticed that a lot of the plot elements, it almost feels like an analog to the way you see stage directions in a play, right? Where generally, like most of the text is a kind of like discursive conversation.
So, Leon, can I ask you to put a pin in that, because I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So let's look at an example of that, okay? But you're right in terms of like it's not really a novel in the sense that it's not primarily story focused. It still is periodic, it still is episodic, and the main thing that happens is that they say Torah to each other. So let's see a good example of that. But really the point is that the dynamics are happening, and it's deeply fabulistic, right? It's using these imagery in these really thick and powerful ways. Okay, and also kind of pushing back on this thing. So the Zohar also does not work linearly. It does not work linearly at all. The Idras Zuta comes like the Idras Zuta is like the real climax, but it's before the Idra Rabbah in the book. Like it's very complicated. It's very complicated. There's not like a coherent narrative, and also, what we're talking about when we talk about like the narrative of the Zohar is what's called Guf HaZohar, the body of the Zohar, the main text of the Zohar. But that's an editing choice. There's a lot of texts in the Zohar, and we're looking at one of them now. So this is a narratival section called Rav Mativta, and it starts in the middle of a sentence. It just starts with the line. It's like in medias res. It might be on purpose. It might mean that we don't have the complete text of it. Unclear. But it starts, one with another, they spoke what could not have been uttered until now. Whoa. Okay, so that's just a very cool way to start a setting, right? And they emerged from that entrance and sat in the garden. I want to make sure I'm like keeping all of the scenes, synthesized here, right? We're staying in the garden imagery. We're staying with the imagery of light. Under the trees. Okay, we're still we're just like there was the garden in Eden in the before times. In some way, they're able to access it again through Torah, through mystical experience, get back to the ideal before time or the ideal after time, something outside of time, right? To reach this Edenic state, this Garden of Eden, they're able to access it. There's an idea we see later that every day at midnight, God, the souls of the righteous ascend to heaven, and God delights with them. Mishta'asheya, but the word delight is not nearly intense enough. God has pleasure with the souls of the righteous, learning Torah together, delighting in each other's presence, shining in each other's manifestations, right? You're taking in the Ziv HaShechina, and things that are seen as only able to access in the afterlife or in, etc. These things that the Zohar say, no, these things aren't just after life is over, but rather these are the eternal that you're able to experience now. You're able to, in some way, contact the real, even in this world, by going through it. Right? Talking about going through reason, going through the world into the world that is coming. Right, the world that you're able to approach. Okay, so they end up accessing the garden in some way, and they end up meeting all of these Rave Mativta, Rav Mikra, Rav Matnitin, right? All these angelic masters of Torah, and they learn Torah from these angels again and again and again. We're going to skip a bunch of this. But finally, they were sitting and discussing all night. So again, this is like narrative, right? This whole thing is a setting, it's a story, in which the disciples, right, the chavraya, the holy friends, the companions, go on a heavenly journey. It's a road trip. They go on a heavenly journey together. They go to the national park, right? They go to the Garden of Eden, and they're hanging out with these angels and learning Torah from them. And they're sitting and discussing. The angels are with Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, all night. And they say to Rashbi, "O pious Holy One, light of the world, take this tablet and this lamp," right? Take your notebook and your flashlight, and write these words, "For our time has come to visit our graves until midnight." Okay, so who's he hanging out with? He's in heaven, as it were, right? He's in the Garden of Eden, heaven, hanging out with souls of ancient rabbis, like from the Mishnah. And they say, okay, the sun's come down. Now's the time for us to go back to our graves. The souls return to their graves, and they have to stay in the graves until midnight, when they can come back to heaven and then hang out with God again. Okay, so our time has come to go back and visit our graves. And this is, by the way, why there's a lot of halakha about how we treat the dead, right? Because we don't really believe, in a sense, that death is even if you don't believe in the afterlife or things like that, still we have this inherent belief that there's dignity that needs to be upheld and cared for in death. And that's symbolized here by saying the souls don't just go away. They come back to the body, right? So the body needs to be cared for. That's why I need to do shmira and the like. And when the Holy Blessed One enters the garden to delight with the righteous at midnight, the time when each soul there ascends. Tomorrow, we will be with you, since permission has been granted to us to complete the gift you've been granted. So what's going on? Rashbi is on the cusp of receiving revelation that's been unprecedented, maybe even greater than the revelation at Sinai. And we'll see why kind of that anxiety is going to show up in a minute. And the souls are saying, we're actually going to leave you on your own for a little bit. Maybe a little bit like the long dark night of the soul type thing, or you're going to be on your own and you gotta write it all down, make sure you really know it. And we'll come back. We'll meet, we'll like reconnect, we'll circle back, right? We'll meet up again tomorrow. And they flew away, and Rabbi Shimon wailed and wept. There's a lot of crying in the Zohar. This is part of what I wanted to include it for. But it's not cry, as we're going to see in a second. It's because, again, flow. What is crying? Crying is when something inside of you can't be contained anymore, and it starts flowing outside of you. Crying is it's the betrayal of the truth, right? It's our own revelations. It's our own emanations, right? It's something inside of us coming out. So when someone cries in the Zohar, it's when something big is going to happen in terms of something being revealed. So Rabbi Shimon wails and cries. There's also actually some writing about how maybe like crying is also a way to like enter a heightened psychic state, right? To like really like the heights of emotional intensity, which you need to be in this level. But then he cried and put his head between his knees, which probably refers to some kind of meditative position. If you remember, we actually saw an example of that in a previous class, of a way to maybe like get all the blood to go to your brain or something like that, or maybe to like achieve a certain kind of meditative, like yogic posture. But you put your head between your knees. And also, what does he do? Like people did or still do when they got off the plane from El Al, right? You kiss the ground. So here he's putting his head, like he's very flexible, very impressive. He's doing his Pilates. But he puts his head between his knees and he kisses the ground or the dust of the Garden of Eden. Now, remember, where did people come from? What are people made out of?
Dust.
Dust, right? From dust you came, into dust you shall return.
Yep.
So when he kisses the dust, he's re-accessing the source of all human life. Kissing it, right? Kissing, again, bringing into your mouth this portal, right? This inner and outer, bringing it into yourself and it coming out, right? The kiss. Kiss is also very important in the Zohar as well. The kiss of God as this kind of heightened unitive experience. So just then, right? Again, he's at the height of this like mystical experience. Head between his knees. He's like literally accessing the source of all life. He's under the tree. He's in the garden, right? He's before and after time at the same time. Just then, and here's the proof of the friendship, Leon. He saw the likenesses of the companions surrounding him. He's crying. He's freaking out. He's been left alone. What does he need? He needs his friends. And his friends show up just when he needs them for support. They don't say, look, this is important. It is friends. They perform friendship for him. They enact friendship. They say, do not be afraid. They give him emotional support. They say, do not be afraid, Bar Yochai. Do not be afraid, Butsina Kadisha. Write and rejoice in the joy of your master. In other words, part of the tears, besides it being a sign of revelation and excitement, is also a sign of anxiety. There's in the Idra Zuta, it says like, do I have permission to reveal? Do I not have permission to reveal? Can I reveal this like very deep secret Torah, or should it be kept secret? Right? This is the anxiety of Kabbalah. This is the anxiety of mysticism. Secrets. Secrets should not be revealed. That's what makes them secrets. So how can you ever tell a secret? Once I tell you a secret, it's not a secret anymore. So there's anxiety about disclosure. Right? There's anxiety about telling the truth. About like imagine waiting for something you've waited for your whole, you've been like waiting to get this cake that only shows up once in like a lifetime or something, and then like your whole life has been waiting for this cake, then finally you have this cake, and like what it's done, right? To completely exhaust something is scary. Torah, though, can't be exhausted. So there's this kind of ever recurring anxiety, but then reassurance. Torah is a well that never stops flowing. So he's freaking out. He's like, can I reveal this? Can I reveal this? Remember, the angels, I mean, the souls already said, you have permission. You have permission to be revealed for this. You can do it. This is a gift you've been given. Torah is a matana gemura. It's a complete gift. But then he's left alone. He's like not sure. He's doubting himself. He's crying. His head's between his knees, etc. Maybe he's doing his breathing techniques, right? And then the friends come and say, don't be afraid. Don't be scared. You can do this. You can write it all down. You can reveal the Torah. Write and rejoice. You have permission to have joy in this. You don't need to have anxiety. It's admirable that you do. But you have permission to be in it. Because it's been given to you. And you are entrusted with it. So be in it. Trust yourself. Write and rejoice in the joy of your master. You have been...
Can I just ask,
Yes.
like the companions are the dead souls?
No, the companions are his friends.
So
They're the souls of his
also
friends
have-
who are also in the Garden of Eden. The
so
other
they're also, they're humans who have actually also reached this level of wisdom and holiness. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just
No. Thank you for clarifying. No, exactly. They have achieved. They're on a spiritual journey. They are all in the Garden of Eden together. Now, it might be that like they're there kind of like as holograms because their likenesses are there. So maybe they're like astrally projecting themselves or something like that. Whereas Rashbi seems to be like fully there. So maybe there's a difference again in like level in terms of like ability. But they're there in some way or another, like maybe in his consciousness, or maybe as spirits, or something like, or astrally projected, something like that. They're appearance. They've appeared there in some way. Okay. So he has permission. He feels encouraged. He feels supported, and he writes all the words he heard over that whole night, studying them and poring over them, not omitting a word. And his lamp stayed lit all night. That's symbolism, right? I just want to be clear. Symbolism. And it stayed lit all night until the break of dawn. And when morning came, he lifts up his eyes, and there's bright light that fills the whole sky. And then he's like, wait a second. Maybe it's illusion. And he closes his eyes, or he lowers his eyes. But the light doesn't stop. Because the light is not just physical. The light seems to be, in a way, metaphysical. So the light is like true, beyond experience. It's not just he's seeing the sun. The lamp isn't really a lamp, right? The lamp is the lamp is a symbol. He is the lamp, right? He's called the lamp. He is the light. The revelation is the light, right? Regardless of whether the clouds are blocking the sun, the light is shining, right? Tears, blockage, but it's about flow. The light is flowing. The light is shining. And that's what the Zohar is trying to... Again, it's not telling us something to believe. It's inducing something in us to experience. So one of the ways that Melila Hellner Shed, Moshe Idel, and other scholars of the Zohar have written is that the Zohar isn't just telling us about something. The Zohar is trying to get us to experience it as well. It's trying to trigger us, program in us in some ways, trying to induce an experience in us. A mystical experience, maybe? And that's why, again, going to the original language, the rhythm of the language, the way it's maybe hypnotic, the way it's kind of engaging us in that pre-linguistic kind of way, tuning ourselves into something, right? It's trying to make something happen to us. He lowered his eyes, but it returned as before. He saw the light filling the sky, shining, and floating in that light was the likeness of a house with several rooms. Rabbi Shimon, here comes the trick, rejoiced, but at that moment, it was hidden away. Now that's not the end of the passage. The passage keeps on going. It's a long section, Rav Mativta. But we see something deeply important about revelation, about mystical experience, something that Rambam talks about actually in his introduction to the guide as well. He describes Torah and truth, or Torah revealing its secret meaning, as gold in silver encasement, right? That the gold is inside of the silver. If you spin this globe or this apple around, you'll see flashes of the gold, but they keep on being hidden. And that's what the Torah does. And this is the way the Zohar describes it. It opens itself up and then closes. It settles, but doesn't settle, right? It dwells, but doesn't dwell. It reveals, but doesn't reveal. And that's, I think, describing the dynamic nature of experience, not of memorization. It's not about facts. It's not about doctrines. This isn't a didache. It's not saying, here's the theology of Kabbalah. This is what you need to believe about the Sefirot. It is trying to give you an experiential access point. But experience by its nature is fleeting. So the question for us is, can we train ourselves to be open and ready to it when it's ready, when it's available to be experienced? That's the Zohar. And I think really what I've been, like, over the course of this, we'll start at the beginning, we'll go to the end, and I'll get the reason I wanted to look at all of this together is that Zohar uses a narrative framing, right, of the rabbis and the social setting, because it gives us the setting of what's happening between people. And we see that's both happening inside of Rashbi, the anxiety, the worry, the need for reassurance, the encouragement and support of having a social supportive friend network, and the fact that where we're talking about multiple elements, what's happening is it's flowing between them. It's flowing inside of you, it's flowing between them, it's flowing between you and God. But the content of it, of the narrative, is poetry, in the sense that it is moving, it is imagistic, and it is dynamic. And it's trying to evoke or induce an experience in you. And it's not about what you can store away in your brain, but rather about training yourself to be open for when it's ready to happen. And the Zohar is not a book to read like a novel, but rather a book to a partner with you on your path. The Zohar is the friend in that way, or it embodies the friend.
What do you mean? What do you mean when you say when it is ready to happen? When what is ready to happen?
Whatever experience is, whatever revelation, whatever access point to something other than just this. Some kind of contact with a dynamic living God.
So you're sort of suggesting, or perhaps revelation. Just out saying that there's some moments where, you know, there's more potential to having that kind of experience than others, and the Zohar is trying to, it's almost like you know, helping you prepare yourself for that moment, because if you're not prepared, you could possibly miss it, or not. Well, how would you put it? Not take advantage of it?
You won't be open to it. Like, it'll pass you by, right? The question, you know, like Choral Concert, my favorite CBC Music radio show, is on every Sunday at 9 a.m. But unless my radio is tuned to CBC Music, I don't hear it. But it's broadcast then, right? So the question is, am I readying my instrument to be able to receive what's being revealed?
And is that an idea that's introduced into sort of Jewish mystical thought by the Zohar, or is that something that's...
Yeah, so I would say it is I mean, we talked about this in the first semester as such, that Kabbalah is trying to encourage or frame a relationship to Torah that is alive and dynamic, one that's not just about Torah of knowing, but Torah of experience, Torah of access to something real through it. That the revelation, in a sense, Torah didn't just happen then, Torah is happening now. And what makes the Zohar special isn't just that it's cool and isn't just that it's beautiful, although it's both of those things. What makes the Zohar special is that it is embodying that. It is demonstrating it.
But is that an original idea for that time though, to suggest that there's you know, that like there's a almost like a temporal differentiation between when you have more or less potential access to divinity or inspiration,
right?
And you know, and that you have to prepare yourself for those moments. Is that like an original idea for that time, or is that something that is kind of being drawn on from, you know, previous Jewish thought,
right?
or
So
you know, other thought?
I'll just answer briefly. Oh, that's a fantastic question, and I think that is maybe in a sense what distinguishes Kabbalah vis-a-vis, let's say, non-mystical dynamics in Judaism, is that Kabbalah insists that that the real, right, the real living God is accessible in some way, even now. And Torah provides the means through which that contact, whether it's like ultimately the mystical experience of union or something maybe like just more kind of parv or whatever, but some kind of contact or nearness, closeness with God is still available in some way. The Talmud is kind of framed as like a text of distance, right? Revelation is over, prophecy is over. So what the rabbis have is the Torah, what's been revealed in the past, and their tools to make it mean something that they can authenticate. But the Torah is described in Midrash as being like a ksuba, right? A wedding contract from a deadbeat husband, right? The husband gone away, or maybe he's been like kidnapped or something. He hasn't returned, and what he leaves with his wife with is a ksuba, right? The wedding contract, and she just like reads it again and again and again, and believes that he's coming back one day, and then he does, and they have a very romantic reunion. And ironically, the Midrash is saying, right, so we're the wife, God's the husband, it seems. The Torah is the ksuba, except it's not Mashiach yet, right? So we're actually still waiting. And so what's the ksuba? The ksuba is a presence of absence. The Torah is a mark of God's absence, right? The Torah is what God told us when we were together, and we're not anymore. And all I have is the picture book to page through and to cry as I page through my photos album on the Facebook of like looking at my ex, right? Like that's the Torah. I know I'm heightening that image a little bit, but the point is that that's a model of thinking about Torah in which it exists in the past, and the way we bring it into the present is using our reason and using the tools and making sure we have an accurate understanding of it using the ability that we have. But the contact with the real, right, with the giver of the Torah, that's locked in the past.
Mm.
But mysticism is insisting, no. The origin of revelation is in the past, but we say when we come to the Torah, we don't say Baruch Hashem Natana Torah. We say Baruch Hashem Notena Torah. We say, blessed are you God who gives the Torah in the present participle, meaning that the Torah is still being given. And the Zohar is not a handbook to teach you how to do that, right? That's more like an Abulafia type text, which is like a yoga, Jewish like kind of meditation handbook. This is more like, again, you are witnessing people doing that. But that act of witnessing, right? The phrase you keep on seeing in the Zohar is tachaze. The Talmud says tashma, go and hear, go and learn. But what does the Zohar say? Tachaze. And I use that as kind of the code word in the promo for the class. Go and see. The Zohar is a practice of witnessing, of empathetic witnessing. You are witnessing scenes. I think actually the example you gave of the play before was quite right. You are looking at scenes, but like any good drama, it's making something, it is bringing you into it too, right? Through the spectating act, through watching it, right? You're watching them watch it. You're watching them as they watch God. right? Because there's a lot of, remember, who are the enlightened? They're the ones who are mistakle baraza de chochmasa. They are gazing into the secret of wisdom. So it's the spectation of it is fascinating. They who are the enlightened, they are peering in, using their ability to see in, to gaze into the inner hidden secrets, and you are watching them. You're watching them as they watch the secrets, right? So it's this mediating daisy chain of witnessing, of gazing, of looking, spectating, right? But that imagery, as we know from actually like kind of ancient theories of sight, ancient theorists of sight believe that it's not just you kind of like, your eye wasn't passive, your eye was active. The idea was kind of, the metaphor was like your eye shot out like a hook and brought what you're looking into you. That's what it's like to look in this kind of medieval, ancient, mystical mind. It's not just you're not just an antenna. You are by looking, you are actually in some way gaining. It's a haptic kind of looking. It's a contactful looking. By looking, you are in contact with what you're looking at. It is an engaged kind of watching. And that's what the Zohar doing. The Zohar is giving you access to witness secrets. And by witnessing secrets,
Sorry, go
it
ahead.
induces something special in you. Yeah, Lauren.
Don't you have to be like on a really high level, like to be an enlightened one, to be there? I mean, I had understood you don't even touch Kabbalah Zohar until you've like already been a Torah Chacham, and until you've already know Talmud like Me'achuz, and till you're at least 40 and way beyond that.
So
but
everything that was instituted in the late 17th century, but yeah.
Okay, but and I'm not criticizing you, but I mean, my understanding would be that to get to that level, you'd have to be like an amazingly, a real,
yeah,
somebody very righteous.
Yeah.
You know, a tzedek.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying before. Is that like, I think that's something really to take very, even though we have the Kabbalah Center, and even though I'm teaching this class, and it's framed as an introduction, it's accessible and the like, and I think because there's what that should be available and accessible to people, because it's a very important, essential dynamic in religion. I think this is what people need, and it's something that really helps people. It gives people language that's really helpful, and it gives people frameworks of thinking and feeling that are really helpful in thinking about God. But your words of caution are, I completely agree with, that this is a lifelong process. It is something to have immense humility for.
Yeah.
And nothing in this is like you don't just jump into the deep end. This is what it's like to be in a lifelong process, not just of like knowledge, but of commitment, right? It's a commitment to the path, to walk. We're actually going to see, I think as early as next week, how essential the metaphor of the path is. And so Torah in the Talmud happens where? In the base Midrash, right? In the Torah place. It happens in the synagogue, right? The special Jewy places. Where does revelation and Torah happen in the Zohar?
By the river.
By the river, on the road,
in a garden,
in a garden, in a rest, in like a what's it called, like a way station, what's it called, a rest stop on the highway. Right. And it comes from the margins. It comes from children. It comes from a donkey driver, right? A taxi driver. It comes from unexpected places, and that's teaching you something really important. And we'll talk about kind of the shift from center to margin.
Okay.
Next week. And that's why the Torah, again, dynamic. It's moving. It's a path. Like the river, it always happens on the road. Right? It happens on the road. So,
because Rashbi spent, what, about 13 years in the cave?
Yeah. That image is invoked sometimes. But yeah. Okay. Thank you all so much for joining. It's always really a pleasure to learn with all of you. And I'm really excited to continue. So next week we will be looking at the dynamics of the path and the margins in the Zohar as kind of the main setting for where Zohar happens, for Revelation and Torah happen. And then in future classes, after that, we'll be looking again like kind of dynamic, reviving Renaissance relationship to language. And the fourth class, which will be private, that will not be published. That will be a class on Eros and love and romance in the Zohar, which is essential to understanding the Zohar's core, really. And you can't talk about the Zohar without talking about Eros and eroticism. And because of that, I think it's important to keep that private. Make sure it's a safe space in which we can, we can like work this stuff out and not be worried about being recorded as we do. Because this is, again, like Lauren was saying, there's a reason the stuff is sensitive, right? And it's because you need a certain kind of sensitivity and experience to be able to kind of process the daring language and the daring images. And then last but not least, and this one will also be, I think, private, probably, is probably on Pesach, because it'll be right before Passover. But it will really be about evil. It will be about evil, about redemption, about liberation. So again, also essential themes in Zohar about Sitra Achra, briefly today. And something that distinguishes the Zohar from other Kabbalistic texts is its how seriousness it treats the question and the existence of evil. So thank you all so much for joining. We have another class on Thursday evening at 7:30 about maybe somewhat similar themes: joy, ecstasy, and the law. How these things can exist together on Purim. Really, really, really cool stuff. But a really powerful, I think, way of understanding Purim that I believe in very strongly. A move away from hedonism and instead towards other-oriented celebration. And we will be having our first Kabbalah Shabbat online in a long time at 4:30, and also a reading of Parshat Zohar, which is a very important mitzvah, so make sure you don't miss it, hearing the maftir for Shabbos Zohar. And make sure to tell people about that. We'll be providing that on Zoom, and then the return of Kabbalah Shabbat, and then Havdalah at probably 6:45, 6:50. And then we'll back to Zohar on Tuesday. So thank you all so much for joining. And
Thank you very, very much.
end the
Thank
recording.
you, Josh.